In the 1960s, a gardener watered plants at a Beijing botanical garden. He had once owned the throne room a few miles away. Another emperor's coffin was held back from burial by creditors chasing unpaid bills. Another man's bones sat under a palace floor for 17 years while the world assumed he had a grave. Another never signed an abdication in his life. A law did it for him. Empires don't end in one dramatic moment. They end in documents, train carriages, and receipts. 10 last emperors. 10 ways to lose everything. The man at number 1 lost the most. These are the last men to hold an imperial title in their own states. Not kings, not pretenders. The last. We're counting down from the softest landing to the hardest, and the question under all of them is the same. What document ended this, and who signed it? Number 10 didn't abdicate. Someone else announced that he had, and by the time he objected, his empire was already a republic. Wilhelm II was supreme warlord of Germany. He changed uniforms several times a day. He had an imperial train, palaces at Potsdam, and a navy built to make him the equal of the cousins running Britain and Russia. Every official portrait was arranged to hide a withered left arm, now the crack under the marble. By 1917, Wilhelm was not running the war. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were. He had become a mascot for a military dictatorship, and a mascot is the first thing thrown overboard when the ship goes down. Sailors mutiny at Kiel. Workers' councils spread city to city. Ludendorff demands an armistice and lets the blame settle on the throne. At Spa, Wilhelm talks about marching the army home to crush the revolution, until General Groener tells him the army will not follow him anywhere. Berlin stopped waiting. On the 9th of November 1918, Chancellor Max von Baden publicly announced the Kaiser's abdication before the Kaiser had agreed to it. A republic was proclaimed that afternoon. Wilhelm crossed into the Netherlands the next morning and signed the actual document 19 days later, into an empty room. And this is exactly why he is only number 10. The Dutch refused to extradite him. He bought a country house at Doorn, and under the settlement with the new German state, dozens of railway wagons of furniture and art followed him across the border. He chopped wood for photographers and wrote memoirs blaming socialists, Britain, and Jews. He died there in 1941 under German occupation, still waiting for a restoration the Nazis never intended to grant. Huis Doorn is a museum now, furnished the way his household left it, down to the snuff boxes. His mausoleum stands in the garden under a condition he set himself. He does not go home until the monarchy does. He is still in the Netherlands. He lost an empire and kept the dining set. The next man couldn't afford his own funeral. Number 9 ruled 6 centuries of empire and left his own capital on a foreign warship, in the rain, with luggage. Mehmed VI was the last Ottoman sultan, and the Ottoman sovereign was an emperor in every sense that mattered. One of his inherited titles was Caesar of Rome. Dolmabahce Palace sat on the Bosphorus with its marble staircase and its chandeliers. He was caliph, and his name was spoken in Friday prayers in mosques far beyond his borders. The weakness was visible from his own windows. By 1918, he governed an occupied capital with allied warships at anchor. Real power had moved east to Ankara, where the general who held Gallipoli was assembling a rival government and a rival army. The chain ran fast. Defeat. Occupation. He signs Sèvres, the treaty that carves up Anatolia. The nationalists reject it and then win the war he had already conceded. Ankara begins speaking for Turkey abroad. 2 Turkish delegations cannot both sit at the Lausanne Peace Conference, so one of them has to stop existing. No army entered the palace. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate by resolution. On the 17th, he boarded the British battleship Malaya and left. 16 months later, the Caliphate went too, and the same 1924 law expelled every member of the House of Osman and stripped them of citizenship. Passports, not bayonets. He settled at San Remo. An exiled court is expensive, and he had no treasury behind it. The money ran out in about 3 years. He died in May 1926 in debt, and it was widely reported that creditors held his coffin until the bills were settled. He was buried in Damascus, in Ottoman soil that was no longer Ottoman. Here is the twist. His cousin Abdulmajid was made caliph without the sultanate, the spiritual title, with no state, no treasury, and no army under it. It lasted 16 months. The dynasty's final office was a job description with nothing attached. 600 years of empire ended with a vote, a wet morning, and an unpaid bill. The next emperor gave his crown away on purpose, and it bought him nothing. Number 8 handed over the imperial seal and the golden sword himself in public and said he would rather be a citizen of a free country than an emperor of a colony. Then he spent 10 years being passed around by the people who took it. Bao Jai ruled from the forbidden purple city at Hu, Mandarin ranks, a ritual calendar, hunting lodges in the highlands, a court that had run the Nguyen dynasty's ceremonies for a century. The proof of it was a golden seal cast in 1823, the object that made an imperial order real. His weakness is simple. He was an emperor inside a French protectorate. The court kept the ceremonies. France kept the treasury, the police, and every decision that counted. Then, in March 1945, Japan shoved France aside and handed him independence, which meant becoming the figurehead of a second empire that was also about to lose a war. Japan surrenders. A vacuum opens. Famine has killed enormous numbers in the north. The Viet Minh move into the cities with organization nobody else has. Hu is surrounded by a reality that ritual cannot answer. On the 30th of August 1945, at the No Mon Gate, he abdicated and handed the seal and sword to Viet Minh delegates. A dynasty ended with an object changing hands. He became citizen Vinh Thuy and briefly an advisor to Ho Chi Minh. Then it got worse, because he was useful. Exile in Hong Kong, then back in 1949 as head of state of Vietnam, an ex-emperor rented out as a symbol by the same colonial power he had walked away from. In October 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem removed him with a referendum. The official result was over 98% against him, with more votes counted in Saigon than there were registered voters in the city. He died in Paris in 1997, under a modest stone in Passy cemetery. The seal outlived everything. It left the country, surfaced at a Paris auction house in 2022, and was negotiated back to Vietnam in 2023. It survived the dynasty, the colony, the war, and the man. He gave up the crown so he wouldn't be a puppet, and spent the rest of his life as one. At least he was in the room when it happened. The next emperor may never have signed the document that erased his country at all. Number 7 watched an empire disappear in a single afternoon. No revolution, no battle, no crowd. And Korean scholars still argue he never signed the paper that ended it. Korea declared itself an empire in 1897. New regalia, new coins, new ranks, a modern-styled army, foreign legations in Seoul, and a dynasty that had governed the peninsula since 1392. But the empire was declared precisely because Korea was already being fought over by Japan, Russia, and China. Sovereignty was announced, not possessed. Sunjong's father, Gojong, was forced out in 1907 after sending a secret mission to The Hague that was refused a hearing. The Korean army was dissolved that year. After that, the annexation was mostly administration. Japan wins its war with Russia. The 1905 Protectorate Treaty takes Korea's foreign policy. Police, courts, and finances transfer one department at a time. By 1910, there was nothing left to annex. The Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed on the 22nd of August 1910 by the Prime Minister, Ye Wan-yong, and announced a week later. Korean scholars have long argued the treaty was never validly executed, that the emperor's own ratification is missing or improper. That argument is still live, in scholarship and in diplomacy. Sunjong was not deposed, he was demoted. Emperor of Korea became King Yi of Changdeok, a hereditary rank inside the Japanese peerage, living on in his own palace as an aristocrat of somebody else's system until 1926. Then the strange part. The grounds at Changgyeonggung were rebuilt around a zoo and a botanical garden and run as a public park. For most of the 20th century, Koreans visited a royal palace to look at animals in cages. The twist is what became of the family. Crown Prince Yi-un was taken to Japan as a boy and married to a Japanese princess, Yi Bangja. He came home only in 1963, seriously ill, and died in 1970. She stayed, married into a monarchy that no longer existed, and spent her last decades running charity work for disabled children in Korea. Sunjong's funeral in 1926 triggered the June 10th independence demonstrations. The dead emperor turned out to be more politically useful than the living one. Nobody stormed that palace. They redesignated it, then charged admission. The next emperor was tried for treason in his own throne room. Number 6 was put on trial inside his own palace by a company that was technically his tenant. Bahadur Shah Zafar held the title Emperor of Hindustan. He had the Red Fort in Delhi, the hall with the inscription calling it Paradise on Earth, a court of poets, and coins struck in his name across northern India. He also had nothing. The Mughal Empire had been hollow for a century. The East India Company paid him a pension and let him keep the fort and the title. His name on the coins was branding for somebody else's administration. He ruled a building. Then, 1857. The greased cartridge issue detonates inside the Bengal army. Mutinying sepoys march on Delhi because a rebellion needs a legitimate name at the top of it. They demand the 82-year-old poet lead them. He hesitated, then agreed, and became the figurehead of a revolt he could not supply. Delhi fell that September. He surrendered at Humayun's tomb. His sons were killed in custody by a British officer, Captain Hodson. In 1858, he was tried inside the Red Fort itself and sentenced to exile in Rangoon. Emperor of Hindustan became state prisoner. A small enclosure in Burma, a guard rota, a ration allowance. He died there in November 1862. The British buried him quickly in an unmarked grave and turfed it over so it could not become a shrine. The title was not destroyed. It was transferred. In 1877, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. And here is the detail most people get wrong. The verses everyone quotes about him, the lament about not getting 2 yards of ground for burial in his homeland, are of disputed authorship and probably were not his. The most famous thing about the last Mughal may not belong to him. The grave stayed lost for 129 years. In 1991, workmen digging near the site hit brick and found the tomb. It is a shrine now. People visit daily. They buried him without a marker, so nobody would come. A century and a half later, they came anyway. He lost a grave and got it back. The next emperor lost his family. Number 5 ended the largest land empire on Earth in a railway carriage on a siding in under an hour with a pen. Nicholas II was autocrat of all the Russias, and the word autocrat was not decoration. 1/6 of the world's land surface, the Winter Palace. In 1913, the Romanovs celebrated 300 years of rule with crowds kneeling in the streets. He gave his wife jeweled Easter eggs as private family presents. The weakness was inside his own head. He believed autocracy was a religious obligation and reform a theft from his son's inheritance. In 1915, he took personal command of the army, so every defeat afterwards carried his name and left the government to the empress in a court already poisoned by the Rasputin scandal. Casualties climb. Petrograd runs short of bread and fuel. Queues become demonstrations. The garrison refuses to fire and joins them. Then his own generals begin telegraphing him, one after another, advising abdication. His train was stopped at Pskov. He never reached the capital. On the 2nd of March 1917, he abdicated in the carriage. He also abdicated for his hemophiliac son, which was probably not legally his to do, and offered the throne to his brother Michael, who declined the following day. 2 signatures, 24 hours, 3 centuries. That night he wrote in his diary about being surrounded by treachery and cowardice, but the men who pushed him out were his own generals and ministers. The autocracy was ended by the people it had appointed. Emperor and autocrat became Citizen Romanov, under guard at Tsarskoye Selo with a vegetable garden. His cousin George Fife's government withdrew an offer of asylum for domestic political reasons. The closest royal relative they had decided the risk was not worth it. They were moved to Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg, and in July 1918 he and his family were killed. The eggs outlived them. Objects made as private gifts were sold abroad by the Soviet state for hard currency and are now the most expensive relics of the dynasty. A family's private life liquidated into foreign exchange. Remains identified in the 1990s were interred at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in 1998. He was canonized in 2000. Two of the children's remains, recovered in 2007, spent years unresolved. It took him under an hour to lose the empire, and his country 81 years to decide where to put him. He lost the throne in a carriage. The next emperor was warned, offered a way out, and refused to take it. Number 4 was invited to rule by a national vote. The vote was fake, and he appears to have believed it. Maximilian was a Habsburg archduke, brother of the Austrian emperor. In Mexico, he refurbished Chapultepec Castle, cut a boulevard through the capital so he could ride to work, and had court etiquette written out in a formal manual. A European court, transplanted onto a country already in civil war. His throne existed because French troops were standing on it. Mexican conservatives and Napoleon III arranged a plebiscite showing the nation wanted him. Meanwhile, the Republican government of Benito Juarez had never stopped existing. It had moved north. Then the American Civil War ended, and Washington could enforce the Monroe Doctrine and start arming Juarez. Prussia's rise meant Napoleon III needed his soldiers back in Europe. France announced withdrawal. Maximilian's own backers began quietly negotiating their survival without him. His wife Carlotta sailed to Europe to beg Napoleon III and the Pope for help and was refused by both. The French army left in early 1867. He was offered chances to abdicate and chances to run. He took none of them. He moved to Querétaro, was besieged, betrayed, and captured. Appeals for clemency arrived from abroad, and Juarez refused them. He was shot at the Cerro de las Campanas on the 19th of June, 1867. His body was held by the Mexican government for months, then shipped to Europe in 1868 aboard the Novara, the same ship that had carried him there. He lies in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna among his ancestors. Now the twist. He was a liberal. He kept several of Juarez's reforms, which infuriated the conservatives who had imported him, and he was executed by the liberals whose policies he had partly adopted. Too progressive for his sponsors, too foreign for his subjects. And then there is Carlotta. She broke down in Europe in 1866 and never recovered. She lived until 1927 at Bouchoux Castle in Belgium, 60 years after his death, still addressed as empress by her household. Accounts differ on how much she understood. Some say she was never told. Others say she knew and refused it. The empire lasted 3 years. The widow lasted 60. He refused to abdicate and they shot him. The next emperor refused too, and they did not need him to. Number 3 never abdicated. Not in 1918, not in exile, not on his deathbed. The empire was taken off him by legislation, the way you would revoke a license. Karl was Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary, 2 coronation traditions inside one man, head of a house 600 years old. Schönbrunn, the Order of the Golden Fleece, an empire of a dozen languages, held together by a crown that claimed divine sanction. He inherited it in 1916, mid-war, already exhausted, chained to Germany, running on a dead man's prestige. He tried to negotiate peace secretly through his brother-in-law. When that leaked in 1918, he was humiliated in public and became completely dependent on Berlin. Then the empire dissolved without asking him. Nationalities began declaring independence and did not wait for permission. By the autumn of 1918, the successor states existed on the ground before anything was signed. There was no country left to be emperor of. On the 11th of November 1918, he signed a renunciation of participation in state affairs. Read the wording carefully, because it is not an abdication. He never surrendered the claim, so Austria took it by statute. On the 3rd of April 1919, Parliament passed the Habsburg Law. The dynasty dethroned, its property confiscated, its members banished unless they renounced every claim and accepted life as private citizens. Emperor by divine right became a stateless man whose right to enter his own homeland depended on filling in a form. He tried twice in 1921 to take back the Hungarian throne. The second attempt ended with him and Empress Zita removed by an allied warship and interned on Madeira with very little money. He caught a chill, developed pneumonia, and died on the 1st of April 1922, aged 34. Zita wore black for the rest of her life. She outlived the empire by 71 years and was only allowed back into Austria in 1982. Her funeral in Vienna in 1989 used the full imperial rite at the Capuchin crypt, where the herald knocks, is refused entry under every title, and is let in only after answering that she comes as a mortal, sinful being, and then the twist nobody expects. In 2004, the Catholic Church beatified him. The state erased him. The Church promoted him. He is still buried on Madeira. Austria took the empire back with a law and never asked for the body. At least his grave has his name on it. The next emperor spent 17 years under a slab. Number 2 was driven out of his own palace in the back of a Volkswagen Beetle, and for 17 years nobody knew where his body was. Haile Selassie was conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God, heir to a dynasty claiming descent from Solomon and Sheba. There were lions on the palace grounds. He founded the Organization of African Unity and put its headquarters in his own capital. His face was on the currency, and in 1936 he stood at the League of Nations and told the world exactly what would happen if it did nothing about aggression. Then the reforms stopped. Land tenure stayed feudal. A young, foreign-educated officer class had nowhere to rise into. His court was an old man's court. And in 1972, famine hit Wallo, while his administration concealed it. Coverage of that famine reached the world, and then reached Addis Ababa, including film that cut images of starvation against imperial ceremony. Then came the oil shock, inflation, and army mutinies over pay. The Derg began arresting his ministers one at a time, week after week, while publicly professing loyalty to the emperor. The palace was emptied around him before anyone laid a hand on him. On the 12th of September 1974, they deposed him, read out the charges, and drove him away. Not in a state car, in a Beetle, by widely reported accounts. The humiliation was the point. Elect of God became a prisoner in a room on the grounds of his own palace, guarded by his own army. He died on the 27th of August 1975. The Derg announced complications following prostate surgery. Many accounts, including later testimony in Ethiopian court, allege he was killed. The cause remains disputed. No grave was announced. In 1992, after the Derg fell, remains identified as his were recovered from beneath a slab on the palace grounds. Accounts differ on exactly where. They were reburied at Holy Trinity Cathedral in 2000, in a ceremony the government refused to make a state funeral. And the strangest surviving trace of him is 12,000 kilometers away. A religious movement formed around him in Jamaica in the 1930s and never stopped. He lost the throne, the country, the grave, and the official cause of his own death, and he is still a divine figure to people who never lived under his rule. He warned the world it would be next. Nobody warned him. He lost everything once and was hidden under a floor. The last man on this list lost everything 4 separate times, then lived 30 more years inside the country that took it. Number 1 lost his empire 4 times and ended up doing clerical work in the city he used to own. Puyi was made emperor of China at 2 years old, carried out of his mother's household at night. The Forbidden City covered 180 acres, thousands of eunuchs, a court still performing the full ritual of the Son of Heaven around a toddler. The first collapse came on the 12th of February 1912, when the Empress Dowager Long Yu signed the abdication for him. He was 6. Nothing about his afternoon changed, because here is the twist that shaped his whole life. The articles of favorable treatment let him keep the title, the palace, the eunuchs, and a state subsidy. For 12 years he was an emperor inside a republic, a monarch in a walled enclosure with a president governing a mile away. He grew up believing the throne was coming back. The second collapse was eviction. The subsidy came late, then stopped. The court sold and pawned palace treasures to stay solvent. A fire destroyed a storehouse just before an inventory. He expelled most of the eunuchs. A Scottish tutor taught him English and gave him a Western name. Then, in November 1924, the warlord Feng Yuxiang canceled the articles outright and gave the household hours to pack. He walked out of the Forbidden City as a private citizen. The next year it opened as the Palace Museum. His home started selling tickets while he was 200 miles away. The third collapse is the cruelest because it looked like a restoration. From the Japanese concession in Tianjin, with its Western suits and cars and money he did not have, he carried a corrosive belief that he was owed his throne. In 1932, Japan installed him as head of state of Manchukuo, and in 1934 crowned him Kangde Emperor. He got a throne, a palace, a court, an anthem. He did not get to choose his ministers, his staff, or when he could leave the building. He got the crown back, and it was the least power he ever held. By his own account, he signed what he was told to sign. In 1945, the Soviets took Manchuria. He was captured at Shenyang airfield trying to fly to Japan. The fourth collapse was custody, 5 years in Soviet hands. In 1946, he testified at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal as a pure victim, a performance his own later confessions contradicted. In 1950, he was handed to China and spent 9 years at the Fushan prison for war criminals, writing confession after confession. And this is the image that stays with you. He had to be taught to tie his own shoelaces, to do his own laundry, to dress himself. He was in his 40s. He had never done any of it, because other people had always done it for him. That is what everything actually means when an emperor loses it. He was pardoned in 1959, aged 53, as a citizen of the People's Republic. The fifth collapse was the quietest, and barely a collapse at all. He worked as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden, then as an editor in the historical materials section of the Political Consultative Conference. He married a hospital nurse, Li Shuxian. In 1964, he published a memoir called From Emperor to Citizen, heavily edited and politically shaped, which is worth saying out loud. In it, he describes voting in an election as one of the proudest moments of his life, and that story people love to tell, about him buying a ticket and touring the Forbidden City as an ordinary visitor, is exactly that, a story. He died of kidney cancer in Beijing in October 1967 during the Cultural Revolution, with no imperial rights of any kind. His ashes went to Baba Oshan. In 1995, they were moved to a commercial cemetery beside the Western Qing tombs, a private business that sells plots. The last emperor of China lies in a paid grave, next to an imperial necropolis he was never entitled to enter. And here is the part nobody expects. He is the only man on this list who outlived his own titles and became a working private person. It cost him prison, a decade of confessions, and being taught to dress himself. His fall is the most complete here, and the only one that does not end purely as tragedy. Look at what is left of all of them. A furnished museum in a Dutch village, still waiting for a monarchy to come back. A grave in Damascus for a man whose creditors reached his coffin first. A golden seal that outlived the colony and the war. A palace that spent most of a century as a zoo. A grave that vanished for 129 years and came back as a shrine. Easter eggs in glass cases, priced in millions. A widow in a Belgian castle, still called Empress 60 years on. An emperor buried on an island, and an empress who needed permission to come home. A slab in a palace courtyard, and a religion 12,000 kilometers away. A paid plot in a commercial cemetery next to the tombs he was never allowed into. Not one of these empires ended the way we picture it ending. The crown was never the object. The crown was a belief, and belief is administrative. It lives in coins, stamps, school maps, subsidy lines, constitutions, passports, cemetery paperwork. Change the paperwork, and the man inside the title becomes a private individual with an unusual name and no country behind it. Thrones don't end when someone takes them. They end when the filing catches up. And every one of these men found that out on a day that started like any other, with the guards still standing at the door.